Hi, and welcome to another Travel Geek podcast. I'm Kyle O'Donnell, and today I'm talking with James Kahn, whose career has taken him through many different walks of life, certainly not the least of which, though, is having been to novelize big name movies and TV series like Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. My personal favorite, The Goonies. I've always loved that movie. And he's also done like Poltergeist and Star Trek Next Generation. James, thank you so much for being a part of the show today. Tell us a little bit about you. Introduce yourself.
I'm actually initially a doctor, an emergency room doctor. And I got into medicine partly because I loved biology and science, but partly because I've always loved wizardry and sorcery and books and movies about that. And emergency medicine seemed like the closest contemporary thing you could get to that. You could be standing over a dead body and pull that person back to life. And it always felt like a very cool, kind of wonderfully uh, over the top kind of thing to do in today's modern world. So that was one of the sort of mythological things that drove me to medicine. Uh, of course, there was also the helping people and having a day job that would support me and all kinds of, and liking science. But that got me into the emergency room, and I did that for about, I don't know, a number of years. And I'd always been a writer. Even before that, I started writing when I was about 9. I would read amazing stories and Tales from the Crypt's comic books, and find things about them that I wanted to change. I didn't like how they ended, or I wanted to see a new character. So I would rewrite them in my little spiral notebooks with my own changes and my own dialogue. That was, I guess, my first experience novelizing.
That's awesome.
Uh,
That's awesome. And
so
you're not the only doctor out there that has done that. I think Michael Crichton also went that route too, didn't he?
Michael Crichton did, although Michael Crichton never practiced medicine. He went to medical school, and then he just went right into writing after that.
Right.
But I like to think of myself in the company of Chekhov and Arthur Conan Doyle, and they were all doctors. Conan Doyle actually based the character of Sherlock Holmes on a favorite professor of his in medical school, a Dr. Bell, who was renowned in the medical school because you'd have an audience of medical students in one of the amphitheaters, and someone would bring a patient onto the dais who the doctor had never seen before, and the doctor would sit there and tell everybody all about this patient just by watching the patient walk in and watching how the patient acted and asking a few questions. And he was really that kind of character that Holmes was based on.
He sounds a lot like a not just a medical, but possibly neurological and definitely psychological uh,
Yeah,
influences. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. My entire youth, my mother is currently and was at that time a clinical social worker. So
Uh-huh.
she pushed me in the direction of psychology, which was my first undergrad interest. And since then, I've never used it professionally, but been so thankful for having done it because it really does influence basically everything else you do.
Absolutely. And you
So
can bring all that knowledge and intuition to bear on anything else you do.
yeah. Well, you mentioned writers. Who are your influences as writers?
Uh, gosh, my favorite novelists, I think, are John le Carre, especially his Smiley trilogy. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy was my favorite.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal. I just recently watched that actually.
Yeah, yeah. And the BBC did just a tremendous job doing the 6-part miniseries on that as well, with Alec Guinness as George Smiley.
Hmm.
Uh, I loved Lonesome Dove, James McMurtry novel. I loved To Kill a Mockingbird and Winnie the Pooh. It's kind of an eclectic taste. It's pretty much all over the map. I love Stephen King things. Uh, I love the old science fiction novels of the 50s, Heinlein and Sturgeon and Arthur C. Clarke. Those are all, I spent a lot of time my high school years reading all of those novels.
So you were a reader.
Yeah, I was definitely a reader. Some of my happiest memories of childhood are going to the old public library, and that particular wonderful old book smell in old libraries was just fantastic. And sort of sequestering myself there for hours and reading and reading and reading. The
Yeah,
Hardy Boys, first series I remember actually.
yeah, yeah. That makes yeah. I I don't think we've seen the death of libraries just yet, but we've certainly seen a decline.
Yeah,
And
yeah, it's a shame.
I know that feeling. I know that uh, I don't know that it kind of has an essence of it because it's real and it's not something you can flip through on your Kindle.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Even
We actually
though,
just put up a little mini library on our front fence. We bought a doghouse and put a glass door in it and loaded it up with books that we were going to get rid of and just put it on our fence so it faces the street and people come by and take things and some people leave things. It's really a wonderful little social gathering point.
nice, and you're on the West Coast in California. Whereabouts are you?
Yeah, right.
Is that
In California, Southern California.
yeah?
So it's
Nice.
pretty much sunny all the time. So there's a lot of foot traffic, and it's a nice little area.
Yeah. Do you ever find that people trade, like take a book, leave a book, or anything like that?
Absolutely. In fact, we started out filling it with all of our books, and it was quickly emptied, and we started to refill it again. But we found that at this point, at any given time, most of the books in there are books that we've never seen before.
Yeah.
Because people take books and they leave their own books.
Well, that there you go. There you've got the rotating stock.
That's right.
And speaking of kind of like that old world feel of books and being surrounded by the world that books bring into them, you're probably climbing up into your 60s. Um,
Yes.
have you seen the changing I mean, clearly you've seen the changing trends in writing. What's been the biggest change, I think, as far as if it's cultural, if it's in theme? I mean, I loved being influenced by pop culture in the early and mid 80s, and it's
Yeah.
vastly different from now. So there has to be even more huge changes through
Well,
the
my sense is actually people are reading less and less. My kids are all in their 20s and 30s, and they're readers, but they really spend much more time online, and certainly all their friends do. And the kids of that age that I know, they read things in high school and even college, but they're not what I would call readers. They don't love reading. They love being online. They love being on their smartphones and online and doing Hulu and Voodoo and I don't know. It's a different world.
it is.
And
It's
it's training the brain to do different things, and there are, in a way, it's like having a lot of tabs open on your computer. People have, when I wanted to research something in the old days, I would go into a library and go into the stacks, and it would be an hours and hours long process of going through index cards and bibliographies and searching out books. And now you just go to Google and and so the breadth of what you can research is just vastly increased. But I think there's a loss in the depth, and people don't go deeply into discovering things about what they're interested in like they used to.
sure. Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't really agree more. Even I mean, I myself, my first profession out of college basically was after I left Alaska. It was a teacher,
Uh-huh.
and I found that even teaching top middle school science and high school science, and even teaching the middle schoolers, they think in a very physically a different way
Yeah, yeah,
than we do now. They need more immediacy. They are not
yeah, yeah.
nearly as
Much
patient.
shorter attention span, and I think that's it feeds back on itself. But if, even looking at the movies, the way movies are cut is much quicker. There's any fewer like long takes, and it's I don't want to say it's bad or it's a loss. It's a change, um, and I don't know what it means for if it's an actual an evolution of the way the brain thinks. I don't know. It's an interesting thing to watch anyway.
Yeah, speaking to that, my my favorite movies come from the '80s, and I mean Fletch was one. I think another one was um, Dan Aykroyd, Chevy Chase, Spies Like Us,
Uh, uh,
1984, 85, something like that. And
Brothers, I think.
say it again.
The Blues Brothers. I thought you were going to say when you mentioned Dan Aykroyd
Oh
with John.
yeah, yeah. No, that's another one too. That's a little bit earlier. And what is it? Not 1984, but what's the 1941? Is it
Right, right.
that was just like the scripting, the writing in those kinds of movies they just don't do anymore. As you're
Yeah.
saying, I tried to show my students a show that I thought was very cool from my high school years, which was Office Space.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, it went 5 minutes into the movie and nothing blew up, and the kids were like,
Right. Yeah.
boring, moving
Boring.
on.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know.
I was like, you got to pay attention to it. You got to listen
And,
to the plot, and then it makes sense.
and even more than that, I remember, trying to bring my kids the great movies from, the archives, like, Bridge on the River Kwai and
Mm.
some of these, you know, wonderful old movies that had long, long scenes and after literally a few minutes, they would be yawning.
Yeah. Or tapping into their smartphones.
Right, right, right.
Okay, so let's get into your movie stuff. Now, you have had a hand in, let's see, you have a great, um, let's talk about the ones I mentioned on the intro. So, novelizations. I know that you got into writing that, as you said, from like repenning, as you kind of put it, Tales from the Crypt and the other things
Right.
like that. So, how did you move on to the bigger ones, Poltergeist and Indiana Jones and things?
That actually, um, I got into the that racket by going to medical school. Really, I was working in an emergency room in Los Angeles, and we got a call from a woman who I'd never heard of named Kathleen Kennedy, who asked if there was anyone in the emergency room who could help her figure out how to resuscitate an alien. So we said, sure, we can do that. So she came down to the emergency room with another woman I'd never heard of named Melissa Matheson, who wrote E.T. And Kathleen, it turned out, was the producer of E.T.
Right.
And we went through a little dry run of how you resuscitate someone. I took the role of what would soon become E.T. I lay down on the gurney, and my friend Bob Murphy pounded on my chest, and we showed them how you oxygenate someone and do all these things. And they were impressed enough that they said, okay, well, would you be interested in coming down to the set of this movie that we're producing and being in the movie and writing this dialogue and helping us make the scene look realistic? So a number of us, 3 or 4 doctors and 3 or 4 nurses, went down to the set of ET, which is being shot at Laird Studios, which is a small studio adjacent to MGM. It's actually the studio where Gone with the Wind was shot.
Hmm.
And they were shooting E.T. Spielberg was right in the midst of the scene where E.T. was going into cardiac arrest. And so a bunch of us got on all those hazmat suits, and we wrote sort of on the spot, did all that techno jargon. I can't get a femoral pulse. Give him an ample bicarb. And I along with others pounded on E.T.'s chest, and we basically it was basically an ad lib scene. There were, we recorded a bunch of other dialogue that they did filled in later in ADR, which is additional dialogue replacement that you just lay in terms of sound on top of the existing scene.
Right, because you've
But
got a mask on.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I was on screen for a nanosecond. I'm a doctor running in with a clipboard and then pounding on ET's chest, and so it was a wonderful experience. It was wonderful watching Spielberg direct them, even just during rehearsals of the takes. It was very moving. He just did an amazing job, particularly with directing the kid who played Elliot. I'm blocking on his name now, the actor's name. But after a few days in the scene, by that time I had already written and published my first science fiction novel called World Enough and Time. It's the first novel of a sci-fi trilogy that I had done for Ballantine Del Rey. So I got the guts to pull up my bootstraps and gave Spielberg a copy of my novel and said, would you like to make this into a movie? And he said, well, I'm kind of busy right now, but I'll pass it on to one of my producers, who was Frank Marshall. Frank and Kathleen Kennedy were the 2 producers of
Hmm.
that film. So Frank read it and liked it enough, or at least he read enough of it to like it enough to assign me the novelization of Poltergeist, which at that time was in post-production, on the condition that I could write it in a month, because they had hit some snags and they had some production problems and they were
Wow,
behind
yeah.
the eight. So I got all my friends in the emergency room to take all my shifts for the next month. I sat in Spielberg's office, and I didn't use a computer in those days. I just sat at his desk with a legal pad and a pen and wrote, 10 or 12 or 14 hours a day.
Wow.
Wrote Poltergeist. Um, And I had they had a secretary come in the second half of each day, and she would transcribe on an old IBM Selectric typewriter everything that I gave her to write on my longhand pages. So and he gave me free rein to do what I wanted with the novel. So about half the novel is basically what was in the script and in the movie, and then I fleshed out the equivalent of a whole other novel based on ESP research I had done in medical school, actually. And and he loved the novel, and based on that, right around that time, George Lucas was looking around for someone to novelize Return of the Jedi. So first he asked his editor and publisher, who was Judy Lynn Del Rey. She was the chief editor at Del Rey, and they were publishing all the Star Wars series. And fortunately for me, she was also my publisher for my science fiction novels. So she said, well, you should use James Kahn. He does a great job. And then, he heard or remembered that I had novelized Poltergeist, so he called Frank Marshall, who had produced some of his movies as well, and Frank and Stephen both gave me a glowing recommendation. So I got the gig for writing Return of the Jedi as well, based on that. And that was the beginning of sort of my novelization career.
Yeah, that's a heck of a way to start it too. And
Yeah.
I'm just sitting here thinking like only in a hospital in LA would that question ever even come up. You know what I mean?
No, exactly. I know. And it was kind of a boutique hospital on the west side. So we were used to seeing celebrities and stars come in and being whisked in through the ER in the dead of night so no one would see them and getting taken upstairs. So
Right.
seeing celebrities and talking to movie people was not an unknown thing for us.
Right. And so, backtracking to your medical career, you got your start really. You're kind of from Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Right, right.
Yeah, which then kind of brought you to LA for post grad work at USC, maybe?
Yeah, yeah. First, I did an internal medicine internship in Madison, Wisconsin first.
Oh, okay.
Uh, and And at that point, decided I realized I did not want to be an internist. I didn't want to be the kind of doctor who's on call all the time and gets up in the middle of the night. And I was already interested in writing a great deal. So I decided I wanted to go into emergency medicine. And at that point, at that time, emergency medicine wasn't even a recognized specialty per se. And there were only three graduate training programs around the country that had programs in them. One in Chicago at Cook County Hospital, and I really wanted to get out of Chicago. I lived there my whole life. The other was Albert Einstein in New York, and the last one was at USC in LA. So I interviewed at all three, and I interviewed at USC during a winter vacation. And in the dead of winter in Chicago, going out to LA where it's 75 and sunny, everyone in Chicago told me said, don't go to LA. That place is a sinkhole. Everyone hates LA. And I went out there and went to the beach on December 26th, and I thought, what are you talking about? This is fantastic. So I decided to go to LA County for my training, which is affiliated with USC. And that was like the best emergency room training anyone could want. 1,000 patients a day went through that ER.
Wow.
And the Army trained its battlefield surgeons in the ER there because it was the closest to battlefield conditions you could get in a U.S. civilian training program.
Now tell
So
me
it was,
that's because of gangs.
yeah, yeah. So lots of knife and gun club stuff, lots of terrible car accidents. It was an eye opener. It was really exciting. It was commando medicine, and it was great doing that for about 10 years until I got burned out.
Yeah, no doubt. Now, so
And
I
then I
know.
did that for a year actually, and then we four or five of us were recruited to help start the program at UCLA. So after a year at USC in LA County, we took a year off and spent the next year developing the program at UCLA actually. And then the year after that, the program at UCLA opened, and we were the second year residents at UCLA training the first year class at UCLA.
Very cool. And so, how long were you on the professional docket, doctoring and such before your run in with Kathleen?
I had just finished the program at UCLA, so it was like the early '80s. I think I got my certification in emergency medicine around '81, and I was working for 2 or 3 years. She called Actually, she must have called right around 81, so it must have been pretty close to after I graduated. I
Yeah.
was working the.
So you really don't have. I mean, you have a. You're in the medical field now. You probably have having been retired, I guess.
I'm sort of semi-retired. I work 2 afternoons a week now.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so in any case, is there? I guess I'm trying to link the two careers together, which is kind of a tough sell half the time. But I know personally as a writer that we generally don't get the recognition that we deserve because I mean somebody runs out a month of 14-hour days. That's quite a lot of work. But can you tell me a time, not necessarily that you've kind of hit the ground running when you landed in LA. You pretty well had your scene going for you. But could you kind of think of a time where you might have been overlooked for an opportunity or maybe credit for any kind of role in maybe the cinema arts or like writing for the arts or anything?
Well, writing, being a professional freelance writer is a really up and down kind of existence. And for everybody, for even the most successful writers, uh, there are years you have when you're really on a roll and you're getting work and you're getting paid to write, and at least within the circle of writers and producers, you have a certain level of recognition, and it's pure recognition, and that's great. And then for no particular reason, that ends, and then you're down, and then you're looking for work, and sometimes you're not getting anything for a couple of years. So you can be very well paid for a year or two, and then have absolutely zero income at all for a couple of years. And it can get depressing, it can get frustrating. It feels like after you've been on top, people should know what a great writer you are and keep hiring you. That doesn't really happen for anybody. You kind of have a run and then no run and then a run and no run. So you have to get used to that kind of life. That's just what it is.
Yeah, I mean,
Fortunately, a day job that allows me to go back and work as a doctor when I have really downtime as a writer.
well, that's the trick, isn't it? I've when you say it like that from that perspective, you can, and I'm sure anybody really can just sit down and think of a handful of authors who just do nothing but publish books. But outside of that, I mean, there's a few big whammies, and
Right, right. And
yeah,
certainly in television, which is kind of the profession I got into regularly for a while. Um, there are half a dozen or maybe 10 big name writers that the networks all love and go to over and over. But for the rest of the writers, the Writers Guild when I was in it had eight or 9,000 writers, and at any given time, maybe 2,000 were employed.
hmm,
The rest were just working as waiters or getting residuals or
right.
what writers.
It kind of forces you to feel pretty human, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is not bad. It's not bad at all. If drawing, you got to draw from your own humanity to write if you want to be a good writer
That's true.
anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of my complaints and criticisms about contemporary television writers, although I think there's a tremendous amount of great writing on TV, a lot of it's, I would say, particularly network kind of television, is coming out of writers who are basing their writing on other television shows they've seen. Uh, it's like they've gone from film school to writing television shows, and they kind of understand the language of television shows. They don't have a lot of experience in the world with doing stuff in the world and experiencing other people and other jobs and kinds of things that you need to really draw on if you really want to be a deep writer.
Right. Yeah, that or just a drunk.
One of the two. Yeah.
So in talking to you, you speaking of the lingo, do have the lingo. You do have I mean you have the colloquial kind of cinema lingo. You either pick that up as a writer or as a producer, which is kind of like my next work. And I, I in reading up on you, you've done a lot of production work in the past. You've worked on Melrose Place, Star Trek Voyager, and I think most recently I saw the movie The Bet.
Right, right.
That was 2013.
Yes.
What's the transition like from writer to
Uh,
producer, or do they kind of go hand in hand?
the transition from television to features or from writing to producing.
Uh,
In
yeah,
television, in, television is a writer's medium, really, as opposed to features, which are much more a director's medium. In features, the director kind of rules the roost and tells the story and bends the script to the vision that he has. Television is much more created by and produced by writers. And almost every television producer's credit you see on the screen is really also a writer and started as a low-level writer. And what happens is you get your first writing job and you're hired as a staff writer. My first staff writer job was with a sitcom in, I think, 1982 called ER. And it was a Norman Lear sitcom on CBS, a half-hour, three-camera sitcom about an emergency room doctor, emergency room, but it was a comedy. It actually starred Elliot Gould. And actually, I created a role in it for an orderly named Ace the Orderly that was played by George Clooney when he was only 16 or 18 years old.
Wow.
But that was my first job, and my job was just to be, I would sit in all the writers' rooms, breaking stories and helping, throwing in my own 2 cents on making up everybody's stories. And I would get assigned, if usually one script a year, or if I was lucky, two as a staff writer. And then if they like your work as a staff writer, then you're held on for the next year, and you're elevated to what's called a story editor, which is just you get a little more money, you get a little more responsibility, um, and then you're an executive story editor, and then you get to be a co-producer, and then a producer, and then a supervising producer, and then a co-executive producer. And each of these things are all writers. They're all those people all sit in the writing room, and their main function is to break stories and make up stories and write scripts. But each increment along the way, you're given more responsibilities as a producer. So when you get to the co-producer level, you're actually involved in casting the scripts that you wrote and in sitting in on the post-production and in sitting in on meetings with the director to give the director ideas about how you want to see the tone in the script that you wrote. And as that gets higher and higher, eventually you become an executive producer, which is what becomes the showrunner. At that point, you're running the whole thing, and you're writing 4 or 5 scripts yourself, but you're running the writers' room and kind of directing who writes which scripts, and you're involved in casting all the shows. But you're really kind of the vision and the direction of that show is by a person who's been a writer the whole time. And even the directors in television, while they certainly have a great deal to say, they're finally given their direction by the executive producer, who is the writer of that series.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that you've had such exposure. You've been privy to such this world, of course. I mean, I would kind of kill for that exposure because I mean I'm a documentary filmmaker. I don't know if you've heard of anything that I've done, but I do very extremely micro budget docs, but they're nonfiction. You know, I love traveling and covering cultural and historical aspects of travel, and so I'm a fan of, but certainly would probably still be very lost in that world. So that's neat to see that you've had that plus the oh yeah, I also have to have a big boy job too. I'm in the same thing. I teach on the college and high school and secondary levels, and I have to make my films because I love them, not because I'm gonna
Exactly.
get rich with them.
Exactly.
So that's great. So in your production, in your career as a writer and in producing, you have written both Star Wars and Star Trek stuff. So
Right.
be honest. Do you ever catch shit for being a fan of both?
Yeah, I mean, I'm frequently asked which do I like more, and I'm just not going to get in that.
Yeah.
I have too many dogs in that fight. I don't want to. I thought I really am big fans of both franchises.
Yeah.
Um, I loved what J.J. Abrams did with rebooting the Star Trek franchise. I always felt like that the idea behind the Star Trek franchise, they're very different franchises. And the Star Trek franchise really was the embodiment of everything I loved about the science fiction novels of the 50s that I loved so much, that I read so much of, which is using science fiction as a lens, as a metaphor through which to view our culture. And it took all the problems of our culture and transplanted them into an alien realm, which made it much easier to look at in a way. You wouldn't get defensive. There were things that would open your eyes about things to our culture that you might not see, and it was a tremendous kind of philosophical approach to storytelling.
Right.
And I think that's what Star Trek has always tried to do, and sometimes it's done it well and sometimes less well. I was the supervising producer and writer on the last year of Star Trek Voyager, and that was really terrific fun. But for example, the first script I wrote there was called Critical Care, which was about a planet that they went to where every citizen on the planet was assigned a number that was a product of their worth to society. So if they were a ditch digger, they weren't worth quite as much to society as someone who had a great deal of responsibility. And so a ditch digger might be assigned a quotient of 1.2, and a nuclear physicist might be assigned a quotient of 6.7. And when they got sick, because the healthcare services were limited and resources were limited, resources were allocated by someone named an allocator, a computer named the allocator, who gave them the amount of healthcare services that were apportioned according to what their coefficient of who they were, what their worth was to society. And I was obviously doing it as a metaphor for what I saw as things going on in this society in terms of medical care. And it was a way of looking at it, I wouldn't say objectively, but taking it out of purely political discussion in America about, Obamacare and should we have a one-payer system and what about private health care. And we always, in Star Trek, tried to approach a question from both sides so that you could listen to both sides, and after you heard each side, you would say, yeah, well, that's right, too. Here was a civilization that was on the brink of ruin because of various natural catastrophes. And I can't remember what those catastrophes were at this point anymore. But the whole civilization was at risk. So there was a certain sense, a certain rationale, in fact, to giving more of your healthcare resources to someone who might actually save the entire civilization, as opposed to someone who, certainly as a human being they were worthwhile, but if you gave the only resources medically that you had to that person, you might be sacrificing all of civilization. So it was an interesting. That's what I liked about Star Trek.
Do you think, as a writer, and I'm sure you get feedback and response, do you think, in your experience, writing that kind of content, does it empower the viewers to either become educated or gather momentum about what they feel about the problem, or do you think that it feeds into the system? I mean,
No, I think it's at its best, it's intended to I wouldn't say educate the viewers so much as stimulate discussion and have them finish a show and then talk about it and say, oh God, that was terrible the way they wouldn't let that poor janitor have any, his diabetes medicine. And someone else would say, yeah, but then there wouldn't be any diabetes medicine for the guy who was going to put his finger in the dike and save the whole water system. So, we want to generate those discussions among viewers, and then naturally they would develop insights that they would bring into their lives and bring into, our own society.
so what does it actually look like to sit down with a room of writers and to go through it? I myself, I've been in a newsroom as my undergrad. I put myself through college as a photojournalist, working at 5 area newspapers in southern Indiana. So I know what that feels like in the crunch time and all of that. But
Yeah.
what does an actual nonfiction version of that look like?
The fiction version, you mean?
I'm sorry, yes, the fiction version of my nonfiction
Yeah,
world.
yeah. It's so much fun. It was the most fun I've ever had. It's in certain ways. Writing is generally a very solitary kind of occupation, and suddenly being thrown into a room with 4 or 5 or 6 other writers for hours at a time, from 10 in the morning until 6 at night anyway. where you just get to talk to each other, and you talk to each other constantly about all kinds of things, about your lives, about politics, about culture, about movies you've seen, and then about the stories you're trying to make up together. Uh, and you're because you're all writers, you talk about writerly things. So it's from the very broad, from story arcs to, let's see, if this story is about medical care, it should start here, and we know we want it to end at this place, so that's the arc. So there should be kind of these scenes in it. We know we have to have a scene where the doctor is trying to save someone who doesn't have a high coefficient, and he's prevented from doing that by the bureaucrat. So we know that scene's going to be in there. So we're kind of making up scenes that have to be in the script, and then we start organizing them chronologically. But then at some point, the whole story is broken, and someone goes off and writes it, and we start talking about things as minute and picayune as, well, you use that word twice in the same speech. You got to lose that word once in that speech, or that comma doesn't really belong there, or this, stop using so many ands in this guy's, and this guy wouldn't talk with contractions. This guy talks more formally. So it's every kind of writerly thing you can imagine, and it's the kinds of things that a lot of people would just be bored listening to or talking about. But we're all writers, so we're all excited by all this stuff.
Yeah.
So it's just a tremendous social and intellectual and comic and cultural and political and personal kind of exchange all day, every day. It's great.
That actually sounds quite opposite from what I would imagine. Not necessarily in that particular environment, but opposite of what writers, as you mentioned, are kind of used to experiencing.
Yeah. And I gave the best example. There are really shitty writers' rooms too, where it ain't so much fun at all. Where someone is very domineering and stepping on everybody else's ideas, and it doesn't always work out so well. But at its best, it's wonderful.
Right. Yeah, I would. So thinking from my new experience here in Maine, there's, of course, Stephen King is from this
Sure.
area. I was I was dating someone who drove me by this area where he is, whether it's it's known throughout the community that Stephen King recedes from his house into this field where there's this tiny little shack, just this shack. It's all it is. I mean, I think he might have electricity in there or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's where he is posited to come up with his masterpieces, and I find it very much, as you can imagine, opposite to that, where you've got guys crumpling up the shittiest version of whatever and playing basketball with the trash can with
Right.
it,
Right.
and so
I mean, they're very different approaches to writing, and I've done both, and I like both. And when I'm trying to come up with my own very personal either script or novel or book or whatever, as I said, it's a very solitary occupation. You have to sink into yourself, into at least metaphorically a little cabin in the woods like that.
yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what it ends up for being being for me. So, on the Star Wars quotient, since we're already there, do you ever go to Comic Cons, or what's the other one, like WonderCon or anything like that?
Yeah, I've gone to a few World Cons, the sci-fi cons. I just went to the Star Wars celebration in Anaheim, which was the big Star Wars con,
Okay.
kind of getting ready for the release of The Force Awakens in December, and that was great fun. I was kind of blown away. There were 100,000 people there on Saturday.
Wow.
It was an amazing experience. It was very intense. Partly because everyone is so excited about the idea of, I think, of J.J. Abrams rebooting Star Wars to the same level that he did with Star Trek.
Yeah.
That everyone's very jazzed up about the whole thing.
Yeah. And just
So I was signing books there, and hundreds of people coming by and giving a panel on the novelization process. It was really fun.
yeah, that sounds great. I would
I'm doing
definitely have.
the Houston Comic Con in July, and then I'm doing one in Wales called Geeked Fest in August.
Wales, the country.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Excellent. Good coverage. So, what's next on the horizon? I mean, do you have anything in the works now?
Yeah, I've got a lot of things in the works. I just came out with my first original novel in a while. It's called Incarnate. It's a reincarnation thriller, very dark, very actually kind of Stephen Kingish now that I think about it. And that's been out. That came out in the fall. It's been out about a half year. And I did. I think you mentioned I produced a small indie movie called The Bet. I helped form an organization called the Community Film Studio, which is a nonprofit 501c3 organization, community organization, based on the notion of community theater. But instead of doing local stage plays and musicals, our mission is to make feature films.
Hmm.
So we did our first feature, all volunteer, and it was really a cool experience. I mean, we got all the actors off Craigslist, and no one on the crew had ever done a movie before, made a movie before, except for the heads of each department, the sort of Hollywood refugees who were in town. So the head of the camera department and lighting and sound were all knowledgeable, and volunteers would coalesce to their group of interest, and they would get mentored by this guy who had done it for many years. And on the first day of shooting, there were 60 volunteers, and then there was an attrition rate over the first week. So by the end of the first week, there were only 25, but they were a hardcore 25 who kept showing up. And by the end of the first week, they knew what they were doing, and we made a terrific little film. It was a little teen rom-com, and it won the best feature at the LA Femme Film Festival, and was an official entry in a number of festivals. And we just finished closing our distribution deal with a releasing company, so we hope to be releasing that widely soon.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'm going to release my latest documentary on Myanmar pretty soon, and it's definitely not
Oh,
been
cool.
profited upon. So I'll send that your way and see if you like it.
What's the subject in Myanmar?
So, okay, as you probably know, the government of Myanmar is very oppressive. It's a
Yeah.
military junta style regime, and my documentary there is basically how, again, nonfiction, how you can travel there and spend the least amount of money that gets into the hands of that regime and still have a
Oh, how
great
interesting.
time, benefit the locals, keep the money local, things like that.
It's great. It's a
Yeah,
great idea.
yeah.
I have a cousin, I think he's a sort of a second step cousin or something, who did a documentary in Laos on the rock and roll movement in Laos that was suppressed for many years, and now is having a resurgence.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, my documentaries on Laos and Cambodia, I'm sorry, Laos and Thailand are scheduled for probably starting later this year.
Oh,
So
great.
we'll have those out soon too.
Cool.
Well, that's
So what
excellent
you
to
get
find
to.
out that you're involved in that. In fact, when I moved here to Maine, I put out an ad on Craigslist to get the same kind of thing, but I wanted to do like a web series that I've started writing over the last few years called Awkward Andy. And Andy,
Uh-huh.
everybody has had these embarrassing moments, like kind of like if you're a guy and you're standing in the stalls in the urinal, you're not supposed to look at the guy next to you or
Yeah.
whatever. Well, Awkward Andy does all of those things, and it's very
Right,
embarrassing. So,
right.
I've started writing those, and so being
It's great.
one of the adjunct professors here, there's a lot of film enthusiast students, and we've kind of started kicking one of those up together. So I'll
That's great.
see if I can follow
I
that.
have a I have speaking of urinal stories, I was pitching a story at Paramount many years ago, and pitch meeting was over, and I went to the bathroom and started using the urinal, and then while I was doing that, Sylvester Stallone walked in and got at the urinal right next to me, and he looked over at me and he said, "Yo." And I stopped peeing. I was like so startled. I had to pretend I was done and zip up and go downstairs to finish.
He said, "Yo," that was his word of
Yeah,
wisdom
yeah,
for
that
you,
was it. Completely intimidated me.
huh? Well, I heard he's short, right? I mean,
He is. I'm also short. He was my height in boots.
but he's probably twice as wide, right?
Yeah. Well, he was twice as imposing.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah, well, if you're Sylvester Stallone, you've probably had enough nerve-wracking moments come your way that you can handle most anything.
That's right.
So generally, what I do on my podcast is I try to test the speaker a little bit. Certainly, you have plenty of experience. I'm sure you'll have no problem with this. But I'd like to help out the listeners in some way. If you can come up with 10 pieces of advice for all of the novice writers out there, everybody just kind of trying to get a hold on things or get a start, and maybe anything you can
Sure,
think of, just any 10 of
sure.
those.
I don't know if I can come up with 10, but I have some. The first one is I once took a workshop in LA for writers called Writers Boot Camp, and their tagline is "The secret to writing is writing," uh, and their sort of driving force is to get people to write 10 hours a week no matter what, and they aim at basically people with full-time jobs who want to be writers, and there's no way you can't find 10 hours in a week to spend writing. And you can schedule yourself to do it. You can get up an hour early in the morning. You can take an hour after dinner. Doesn't mean you don't have to sacrifice some things. If you like to watch the tube in the evening, maybe you don't watch the tube sometimes.
Right.
To go out for drinks with friends, maybe you're going to sacrifice that a little bit. But you have to make yourself write. You can't say you're a writer or you even want to be a writer and then not write. So that's the first rule, is just keep writing. And it's hard because you start writing and you don't like what you're writing, because no one ever likes their first drafts, and then you stop because you think, this is crap. But it doesn't matter, because that's my second rule, which is the secret to writing is rewriting. There is no such thing as writing something and you have a written thing. You've got to keep rewriting and understand that nothing that you write is not going to be rewritten. I write probably on my scripts, my feature screenplays, I'll write literally 15 to 20 drafts. And when I tell that to people, to young students, to writing students who I'm giving workshops in, they think I'm going to say 3 or 4 drafts, and none of them are prepared to hear that, because they think, well, I'll write something and I'll get notes and I'll rewrite it and it'll be ready to go. But I'm promising you it won't be ready to go. You've got to keep showing it to people and getting notes and giving yourself notes, and then doing another draft. So you got to keep rewriting. So that's number 2. Number 3 is, when people give you notes, if you get a note on a scene or a character or a section of dialogue or whatever the note is, if it's something that you really love and is core to what you think your writing is about, and you think, no, that person is wrong, this really needs to stay exactly the way it is, if you feel really strongly about that, then I think you can stick to your guns and not change it. But if 2 people give you notes on the same scene and they both say there's something wrong with this scene, even if they say completely different things, even if one says, no, this scene isn't right because she shouldn't be going to his apartment, he should be going to her apartment. The other guy says, no, this scene isn't working because it should really be at a bar, or she should be wearing a green dress, or it should be between this guy and someone else entirely. You can't say to yourself, well, these notes are about 2 completely different things, so they cancel each other out, or they obviously don't know what they're talking about. What it's telling you is that 2 completely different people bumped on this scene. Something isn't working about this scene, and you're obligated to tell yourself, I have to look at this scene again and rewrite it. So that's my third note.
Okay.
My fourth piece of advice is, someone tells you this scene doesn't work. The question you have to ask that person is 2 things. If you say this scene isn't working, this is what I was trying to do in this scene. Are you saying it isn't working because you think I was trying to do the wrong thing, or do you think I was trying to do the right thing but I didn't do it right? And those are 2 completely different ways of approaching rewriting that scene. It's important to know which of those 2 things is operative before you go ahead and rewrite it. Are you rewriting it because, was it not working because you were trying to do the wrong thing, or because you were trying to do the right thing but you were doing it wrong? That's 4 pieces of advice. The 5th piece of advice is, get notes from as many people as you can. Show it to all your friends who you think are your friends. show it to people who have some savvy in writing, show it to anybody and get their feedback. And as I said, you don't have to take everybody's feedback, but you have to take everybody's notes seriously and evaluate all their notes and try not to be defensive about those notes. Try to take those notes in. And if someone is giving you notes, it's 5. Part of that, we can call it 6, is don't try to defend what you've done to anyone who's giving you a note. They start to give you a note, and don't immediately start say, no, but you don't understand. No, but this is what I was trying to do. No, but. Just say, that's great. I love your notes. Just give it to me and take it in and register it. And then later you can look at it and decide if you think it's worthwhile or if there's some piece of it that's worthwhile that you can use. Or if maybe, your defensiveness came from a place of feeling like, well, actually, this note does not work for me. And then you don't have to use the note. But don't ever try to respond to notes in the moment by defending what you did. So that's 6. I don't think I can come up with 4 more off the top of my head, though.
Well, those are great. And not only do I kind of see where those have come from, I also see how profound those are across the board. No matter where you go, you're going to find a use for those kind of rules. In fact, I while you were speaking, was thinking of, I don't know how many times, I could probably count on 2 hands in the last 4 weeks, really, the last month in class, where I've given students critiques on things, and that's exactly what people do. They jump to it, and it's not about you're there for the critique. It's an art program.
Exactly. As soon as someone, these days, in recent years or whatever, if I start giving someone a note and they start responding like that, my first response is, shh, quiet. You're not here to defend yourself. Yeah. I don't want to hear what you were trying to do. I don't want to hear anything about why what you did is right. I just want you to hear, this is my note. And then you can do with my note what you want to. Later you can say, his note was full of shit. That's fine. I don't care. I'm just telling you, this is what my reaction was. You should take it for what it's worth and use it or not use it.
And for right now, just digest it, whether or not, take it, leave it.
Oh, here's another piece of advice. This is 7, which is structure is much more important in writing than a lot of new writers give it credit for being. And I think it's adhered to probably much too strictly in terms of the Hollywood film. If what you want to do is write a screenplay to get a movie made or to sell to a studio, those structures are very strictly adhered to a counterproductive degree. But even there, the idea of having a 3-act structure. People in our culture are used to hearing a story in 3 acts. And basically, really, in the most broad sense, all that means is a beginning, a middle, and an end. But it's really helpful to think of there being structural elements to the first act they're notes that you want to hit. You want to find out who the main character is early, and what their ordinary world is, what their life is like before this adventure starts. You want to see what is the moment that's going to send them spinning off into whatever this story is. You want to see what's the moment when they decide, you know what, I'm going to go on this adventure, whatever it is. And that kind of encapsulates the first act. I mean, in movies, the first act is pretty much the first quarter of the film, and the second act is the middle half, and the third act is the last quarter. And because the second act is a long act, it's the whole half of the film, there tends to be a kind of a lull in the middle of it. So most Hollywood movies you see are right in the middle of the film, in the middle of the second act, there's going to be some big kind of plot twist, a turning point, a crisis point, an increase in the stakes, a change of direction that sends the hero in some new direction they weren't anticipating before. And then the end of the second act is going to be the collapse of everything that you were hoping for. You thought everything was coming to success, and you were going in a certain way, and everything seems to fall apart. And then the third act is where you see everything differently and put it together differently, and then come to some final conclusion at the end. And that's kind of a a big overall broad strokes arc of how movies are made. But I think even in novels, it's helpful to kind of keep the sense of that structure in mind when you're writing the novel. And not that you have to do it at exactly a quarter and exactly a half, but to use those elements as guideposts and notes to hit. And if you finish up and you look at it again and one of those notes is missing, you have to ask yourself, not that you have to put that note in, but ask yourself why. Is it missing because I wanted it to be missing? Because in my story, you don't want it there? Or did I just forget to put that in?
Right. That's excellent. Yeah. Muy excelente. All right, James. Tell me a little bit about your, if you have any social media links that you want to plug, if you want to send
Yeah,
viewers anywhere.
sure. Let me tell you about the going on. I'm making my own movie now. I'm making my own little small indie film. It's called Wrong Side Bob, and it's based on. I'm also a singer-songwriter, so I came out with a couple CDs over the last few years of Americana music, folk music, blues, country, little country, and one of them was called "Man Walks Into a Bar," and it was a concept album. Every track on the CD is about one of the people in this bar on a given night. And they're all story songs, and their stories all, or many of them, intermingle, and there's kind of a meta story connecting them all at the end. So I thought that was the basis for at least the inspiration of a screenplay. So I wrote a script loosely based on that. And the sort of short pitch for the script is a drifter with amnesia rolls into this roadside bar one night and comes into contact with an old guy. And the drifter with amnesia is trying to remember his past. And he runs into an old guy who's desperately trying to forget his past because he did something very bad in the old days. And they come together and kind of help each other navigate through those two story arcs until they come to the understanding it really only matters who you are in the present and not what happened in the past. And then along the way, there's a kind of an offbeat little crime story and some quirky bar characters, and it's a small film, but I'm just getting it together now. I'm casting it, I'm scouting locations, I'm financing it, I'm putting it all together, and I hope to shoot it January, February, March of next year.
Very cool.
So it's called Wrong Side Bob, and you can see it on Facebook at the Wrong Side Bob Facebook page. You can see, you can hear me spout off now and then on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at that James Kahn. And I've got a website, which is thatjameskahn.com. And I've also got a personal sort of writer, musician Facebook page called also James Kahn Words and Music.
Is that .com?
No, the .com is thatjameskahn.com. But my Facebook page, sort of attached to that, is James Kahn Words and Music.
Okay. All right, great. James, I can't tell you what a pleasure it's been talking to you. You speak my language, both writing, cinema, filmmaking interests. I hope we can do another one of these, maybe follow up when Wrong Side Bob has exploded and made you millions and millions.
I hope so. Yeah, it was great talking to you. It's really been a pleasure.
All right, thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.